I'm Alara Hawthorne, 34, and my sharp blue eyes, which for too long had mirrored a meticulously crafted facade of corporate invincibility, now found themselves in the opulent foyer of Ashworth Manor. The air, thick with the cloying scent of polished wood and the subtle decay of overblown hydrangeas in towering vases, felt like a physical weight on my chest. This sprawling Boston suburban estate, my childhood home, had never truly been a sanctuary. Instead, it was a grand gilded cage, a stage, where my father, Richard Matthews, 62, annually conducted his performance of familial dominance and veiled contempt. Every single year, it was the same suffocating ritual. My accomplishments, no matter how significant, even becoming the youngest senior investment strategist at Goldman Sachs in New York City, were meticulously dissected, diminished, and inevitably found wanting. My older brother, James Matthews, 40, with his athletic build, neatly coiffed brown hair, and an easy, confident smirk, was always the measuring stick, the golden child against whom I perpetually fell short. His successes, whether in finance or on the golf course, were lauded, magnified. Mine, minimized to polite, almost pitying nods. The stark contrast between our receptions was a constant gnawing ache, a relentless reminder of my perceived inadequacy in my father's eyes. For as long as I could remember, my life had been a desperate quest for Richard's approval. From the relentless pursuit of straight A's in prep school, where every perfect score was laid at his feet like an offering, to choosing a finance major at Wharton, a path he had implicitly dictated, to the grueling 100-hour weeks on Wall Street, where the fluorescent lights of my office felt more like a second home than my actual apartment. Every single decision, every sacrifice, every burning ambition had been fueled by a singular, consuming need, to finally see a flicker of pride in his piercing, critical gaze. I'd navigated the cutthroat world of high finance with a singular focus, driven by an internal engine that never quite let me rest, always pushing for the next promotion, the next record-breaking deal. The adrenaline of closing a complex, multi-billion-dollar merger was exhilarating. Yes, the intellectual challenge a temporary reprieve, but the true reward I sought was that elusive nod from Richard, the one acknowledgement that never came. Even when I earned a 7-figure bonus, enough to buy an apartment, overlooking Central Park and invest shrewdly, the quiet satisfaction was always overshadowed by the thought, would this finally be enough for him? Would this grand gesture finally unlock the warmth I craved? The initial shock of the truth that had recently come to light was a physical blow, a sudden void where my desperate need for his love had always resided. It was like the ground beneath my feet had simply dissolved. Then came the chilling clarity, a sharp, cold realization, the lifelong coldness, the incessant critique, the inexplicable lack of warmth from the man who was supposed to be my father. It all clicked into place with horrifying precision. The pieces of my emotional puzzle, scattered and disjointed for decades, suddenly formed a coherent, if brutal, picture. The desperate, consuming need for his love had evaporated, replaced by a strange, unsettling peace. It wasn't me. It was never me. It was him, and a secret he had kept, a profound, ugly truth he simply couldn't stomach. This revelation, received in the quiet solitude of my New York apartment just days before this dreaded annual dinner, had fundamentally shifted my entire perception of myself and my family. Dinner commenced in the formal dining room, a cavernous space where every sound seemed amplified, designed for grand pronouncements rather than intimate conversation. The clinking of crystal and the hushed murmurs of the extended family created a carefully curated tableau of affluence and strained civility. The heavy velvet drapes, a rich, oppressive burgundy, were drawn, shutting out the last slivers of the autumn twilight, leaving us bathed in the warm, yet somehow sterile glow of the crystal chandelier that hung like a watchful eye above the polished mahogany table. My mother, Sylvia Matthews, 58, ever graceful, with her warm smile and silvering blonde hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, tried her best to steer the conversation towards safer topics. The upcoming charity gala, the recent renovations at the country club, her eyes darting nervously between Richard and me, sensing the unspoken tension that always simmered beneath the surface of our family gatherings, a volatile undercurrent only she seemed truly aware of. My sister, Sophia Matthews, 31, with her bright, expressive face and curly auburn hair, offered me a sympathetic glance across the polished mahogany table. Sophia knew, better than anyone, the emotional battlefield that was a Matthews family dinner, having navigated her own struggles for validation, though hers were less overt than mine. Her own relationship with Richard, while not as overtly hostile as mine, was marked by his casual dismissiveness of her artistic pursuits, deeming them frivolous and a waste of her considerable intellect, a cruel contrast to his effusive praise for James's business acumen. The food, an exquisite multi-course affair prepared by a caterer Richard hired annually from Boston's finest establishments, seemed tasteless. To me, each bite an act of forced endurance. Each morsel of the seared scallops, the succulent duck confit, the delicate crème brûlée, was accompanied by a fresh anecdote from Richard, subtly or not so subtly highlighting James's latest triumph, a successful real estate venture on Nantucket, boasted with inflated figures, a golf tournament win at the country club, described with painstaking detail, a new vintage wine acquisition for his burgeoning cellar, discussed with the reverence usually reserved for religious texts. My own recent coup, orchestrating a complex, multi-billion-dollar merger between two tech giants that had garnered industry-wide attention and a substantial bonus, a feat that had occupied my every waking moment for months, was reduced to a passing, almost condescending remark. "Alara, still crunching numbers, are we? Good for you keeping busy." The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Busy, yes, but not truly achieving anything of substance, not like James, who was building tangible assets, contributing to the family legacy in a way I ostensibly could not. I watched James, with his easy confidence, soak in the praise. He wasn't malicious, not overtly. He was simply the comfortable beneficiary of Richard's pathological favoritism, a role he'd inhabited his entire life without question, accustomed to the spotlight. Part of me, the old, insecure me, still felt a flicker of resentment, a pang of the familiar comparison, a ghost of the girl, who always desperately wanted to be James. But the new Alara, the one armed with undeniable truth, felt a profound emptiness where that pain used to reside. It was like watching a play where you already knew the ending, the dramatic tension replaced by a quiet sense of inevitability, almost of detachment. I found myself observing Richard's gestures, the way his jaw clenched when James mentioned my name, the almost imperceptible narrowing of his eyes, and a chilling understanding settled over me. He didn't just dislike me, he despised me. And now, armed with the knowledge of why, the realization was less a wound and more a confirmation. As the plates were cleared and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee and a delicate berry tart filled the dining room, Richard, emboldened by several glasses of an expensive Bordeaux, rose to offer a toast. His eyes, usually piercing, were now slightly glazed, his posture a little less rigid than his usual military bearing, a faint flush on his cheeks. He raised his crystal glass, the clinking sound reverberating in the sudden silence, drawing every eye to him. "To family," he boomed, his voice echoing slightly off the high ceilings. "And to success. James, my boy, you've truly outdone yourself this year. A real asset to the family name, upholding the Matthews legacy." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the table, finally settling on me, his lips twisting into a sneer, barely perceptible but sharp as a shard of glass. "And to, well, to everyone else, doing their best, I suppose, even the losers." The word hung in the air, a venomous cloud. Losers. It wasn't just directed at me, not explicitly, but everyone at that table knew exactly who he meant. The cruel irony was not lost on me. He was speaking of me, the one who had tirelessly pursued a success he fundamentally rejected. The blood drained from my face, then surged back, a hot flush of indignation that prickled my skin. For years, words like this would have shattered me, sent me retreating into myself, nursing the wound in silence, dissecting every syllable for perceived fault. Tonight, something different happened. The sting was there, yes, a familiar flicker of the old pain, but it was quickly overshadowed by a profound, almost chilling calm. The decades of desperate striving, the endless nights fueled by ambition, the gnawing anxiety of never being enough, it all coalesced into a singular, undeniable truth. The truth, cold and unyielding, was a weapon forged in his own secret, and it gave me an unprecedented strength. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of wood against the intricate Persian rug echoing loudly in the stunned silence that followed Richard's toast. Every eye in the room snapped to me, the carefully constructed facade of familial harmony shattering. Richard, mid-sip of his wine, lowered his glass, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly replaced by annoyance, a familiar tightening around his mouth. James looked acutely uncomfortable, his confident smirk replaced by a pained grimace as he glanced down at his coffee cup, avoiding eye contact, a silent acknowledgement of the ugliness that had just transpired. Sylvia gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a familiar dread, a premonition of the storm to come. Sophia, however, looked at me with a mixture of apprehension and dawning comprehension, a silent plea in her eyes for me to be careful, but also a glimmer of recognition for the fire that had finally ignited within me a long-awaited rebellion. I stood, my posture ramrod straight, my voice, when it came, surprisingly steady, almost a whisper that carried perfectly in the hushed room, imbued with an unexpected resonance. "Richard," I began, using his first name, a subtle but profound act of rebellion, a stripping away of the familial title that drew another sharp intake of breath from Sylvia. "For 34 years I have chased your approval. Every achievement, every accolade, every impossible target I set for myself was done with the hope, no, the desperate delusion, that one day you would look at me and see something other than a disappointment." My gaze met his, unwavering, holding his startled stare, challenging his authority for the first time in my life. I became the youngest senior investment strategist at Goldman Sachs. I closed deals that others deemed impossible, navigating corporate labyrinths with relentless precision. I built a life that, by any objective measure, should have earned respect, if not pride. My voice gained strength, rising slightly but still controlled, each word carefully articulated, precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "But for you, it was never enough. I was never enough. I was always the loser, wasn't I? Always compared, always found wanting." Richard opened his mouth, no doubt to dismiss me, to cut me off with a scathing remark, to reclaim his lost control, to reassert the power dynamic that had governed our lives. But I raised a hand, a simple, decisive gesture that stopped him cold, an unspoken command that, for once, he obeyed. "No," I said, my voice resonating with an authority I hadn't known I possessed, a power born of undeniable truth. "Not tonight. Tonight you listen." I walked deliberately to the center of the mahogany table, my eyes never leaving his, a silent promise of the truth I was about to unleash. With slow, measured movements, I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket, extracting the manila envelope I had placed there earlier that evening, its presence a constant, heavy weight against my side. It felt impossibly light, yet held the weight of a lifetime of pain and a lifetime of liberation. I placed it squarely in the middle of the table, directly between Richard and myself, the seal unbroken, the stark white paper a silent testament to the undeniable truth within. "You called me a loser," I reiterated, my voice dropping back to that chilling whisper, a deliberate echo of his own venom, "and you have, in your own way, called me far worse my entire life. But what you failed to understand, what you refused to understand, is that your disdain had nothing to do with my accomplishments, or my lack thereof." I tapped the envelope with a manicured finger, the slight rustle of paper loud in the profound silence. It had everything to do with this. The silence was deafening, suffocating. The air crackled with unspoken truths, with the weight of decades of deceit, a tension, so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Richard stared at the envelope, then at me, confusion warring with a flicker of dawning horror and fear in his eyes. He seemed to shrink slightly in his chair, the bluster draining from him, his earlier bravado replaced by a pale, sickly pallor, the picture of a man suddenly confronted with his deepest vulnerabilities. James looked from me to the envelope, then to his father, then back to me, a dawning horror creeping onto his face as the implication hit him, the carefully constructed reality of his family crumbling before his eyes. Sylvia's eyes were wide, filled with a complex mixture of dread and profound relief, a silent agony etched on her features, as if a monumental weight had been lifted from her shoulders, even as she braced for the inevitable fallout. Sophia, however, looked at the envelope, then at me, then back at our mother, a silent question passing between them that only they understood, a shared secret, finally on the precipice of revelation, a moment they had perhaps subconsciously awaited their entire lives. I looked at each of them in turn, absorbing their reactions. At James, whose carefully constructed confidence seemed to crumble, replaced by genuine shock and a nascent understanding of his own gilded cage. At Sylvia, whose face was a mask of unspeakable grief and profound relief, a woman finally unburdening herself. At Sophia, whose eyes brimmed with tears, a silent offering of support, a shared understanding that transcended words. Finally, my gaze returned to Richard. He looked utterly defeated, his face ashen, his jaw slack, all the arrogance drained from him. The man who had always seemed invincible, unshakable in his arrogance, was finally stripped bare, exposed not by my words alone, but by his own deep-seated secret, the truth he had so desperately tried to bury. "I am done," I stated, the words a decree, definitive and absolute, echoing with a finality that brooked no argument. Done chasing, done hoping, done seeking validation from someone incapable of giving it. I turned on my heel, leaving the sealed envelope as a final, irrefutable statement of my truth and his deceit. I didn't look back. The dining room, once a prison, now felt like a stage from which I was making my final, triumphant exit, the curtain falling on a lifetime of pretense. I walked through the grand foyer, past the silent, watchful portraits of Matthew's ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow my departure, their stern gazes no longer holding power over me. I pushed open the heavy oak front door and stepped out. The cool night air of Boston, crisp with the scent of autumn leaves, felt like a cleansing balm on my skin, a tangible relief after the suffocating atmosphere inside. The stars, usually obscured by city lights, seemed to shine brighter than ever above Ashworth Manor, a silent witness to my liberation. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight to the obsidian black Mercedes. S-Class, the very car I had bought for Richard just hours earlier, a desperate, misguided olive branch. The keys, still in my hand from earlier, felt like a symbol of liberation, heavy with meaning, no longer an offering, but a prize. I didn't even consider leaving it. It was mine, a testament to my efforts, my success, a tangible representation of my self-worth that no one, not even Richard, could diminish. And now, it was my vehicle to freedom. Slipping into the driver's seat, the rich scent of new leather enveloping me, I started the engine. The powerful hum was a comforting roar, a promise of propulsion forward, a symphony of independence. I engaged the gear, pulled out of the circular driveway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel, leaving Ashworth Manor behind. The mansion's windows, lit from within, seemed to glare at me, a silent rebuke, but their power was gone, their hold on me broken. I navigated the familiar winding streets of Wellesley, past the manicured lawns and stately homes of affluent Boston suburbs, each house a reminder of the suffocating expectations I was escaping. Then, I merged onto the Massachusetts Turnpike, heading west, towards a new beginning. In the rearview mirror, the distant lights of the estate shimmered, growing smaller and smaller until they vanished entirely. I wasn't just driving away from a house, I was severing decades of emotional bondage, leaving behind the suffocating weight of an identity built on a lie. The road ahead, stretching dark and unknown, felt exhilarating, each mile a physical manifestation of my newfound freedom, a journey into the authentic self. The drive back to New York City was a blur of highway lights, the rhythmic hum of the engine, and quiet contemplation. The emotional exhaustion was immense, but it was overlaid with a profound, almost giddy sense of lightness. I stopped only once, at a nondescript service station just over the Connecticut border on I-95. I filled the tank, bought a bad coffee from a vending machine, and stood outside in the cool night air, just breathing, really breathing. For the first time in my life, my thoughts weren't consumed by what Richard thought, or what I needed to do to impress him. They were simply mine. My mind was quiet, unburdened, a vast open space. The silence in my luxurious apartment on the Upper West Side, usually a familiar comfort, felt different now. It was no longer the silence of solitude, but of burgeoning freedom, a vast, open space waiting to be filled with my own truth, my own desires, my own unadulterated existence. For the first few days after the dinner, there was no contact from Richard. Not a call, not a text, not even a furious, scathing email. Just silence. It was a silence that spoke volumes, confirming everything I had suspected about him. A man utterly incapable of facing an inconvenient truth, A man whose pride was so fragile it would rather fracture into a million pieces than acknowledge an inconvenient reality. His absence, once a source of gnawing pain, was now a validation. He truly was incapable of love, of truth, of any genuine human connection beyond what served his own ego. And knowing that, truly knowing it, was its own kind of liberation. There was no more chasing, no more yearning for something that simply did not exist. The emotional tether had been cleanly severed. James did call, eventually. His voice on the phone was hesitant, laced with an unfamiliar discomfort, a tone I had rarely heard from my outwardly confident brother. "Alara?" he'd begun, his usual confident cadence replaced by a strained awkwardness. "Look, about dinner. Dad was, well, he was out of line. You know how he gets when he's had too much Bordeaux." His apology felt hollow, a perfunctory attempt to smooth over an irreparable rift, a superficial gesture to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He mumbled something about family sticking together, a vague sentiment that rang with the hollowness of all. The years we had pretended, all the uncomfortable truths we had implicitly agreed to ignore. I listened, polite but utterly detached. The old Alara would have sought reassurance, tried to mend the bridge, yearned for his support. The new Alara simply noted the superficiality of his words, the way he carefully avoided any direct mention of the envelope, of the truth, of the seismic shift that had occurred. I kept the conversation brief, not wanting to engage in the old dance of dysfunction, not wanting to expend an ounce of my newfound emotional energy on a relationship that had always been defined by a toxic triangulation, a constant comparison I was now free from. He was still Richard's son, still the golden child, and I was finally free of that oppressive comparison, free to define myself on my own terms. My mother, Sylvia, was the first to truly reach out, to bridge the chasm with genuine emotion. 2 days after the dinner, her call came. Her voice, usually so composed, was trembling, filled with a mixture of palpable fear and profound, almost overwhelming relief. "Alara," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, laced with an urgency I had never heard. "We need to talk. Properly, not over the phone. Can you come home?" "Not Ashworth, no. Never Ashworth again. My sister's place, Aunt Carol's cottage in Greenwich, Connecticut. It's quiet there, far from everything." I hesitated for only a moment. A deep part of me recoiled from any family drama, any further emotional entanglement, my instinct to protect my new peace. But a stronger, newer part knew this conversation was essential, a crucial, painful step in my own healing, in understanding the foundational lie that had shaped my entire life. "Yes, Mom," I said, my voice softer than it had been in years, devoid of the hardened edge it usually carried. "I'll be there. Give me a few hours." The drive from New York City to Aunt Carol's cozy cottage felt entirely different from the drive away, from Ashworth. That had been an escape, a flight from confinement, a desperate break. This was a journey towards connection, towards truth, towards a deeper understanding of my own origins. As I navigated the winding roads of Greenwich, the stately homes giving way to quieter, tree-lined lanes off Round Hill Road, a sense of anticipation, laced with apprehension, settled over me. I knew this conversation would be difficult, but I was ready. Sylvia was waiting on the porch, a fragile figure in the crisp autumn air. Her usually composed demeanor, her elegant posture, were replaced by a visible vulnerability, her shoulders slightly slumped. Her eyes, red-rimmed but clear, met mine, and in them I saw a lifetime of unspoken pain, of secrets held too long, of a burden finally ready to be shared. We embraced, a hug deeper and more meaningful than any we'd shared in years. There were no words, just the quiet comfort of shared grief, of mutual understanding finally blossoming between us. It was as if decades of emotional distance evaporated in that one embrace, replaced by an urgent, desperate need for connection and shared truth. Inside, the cottage was small and inviting, filled with the comforting scent of wood smoke and freshly brewed chamomile tea. A gentle autumn light filtered through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, creating a serene, almost sacred space for what was to come. We sat at a small antique table, steaming mugs warming our hands. The quiet crackle of the fireplace, a soft backdrop. Sylvia began to speak, her voice hushed, almost a whisper, as she recounted a story woven from pain and desperation, a story she had carried alone for decades, a heavy cloak of secrecy. She spoke of her youth, of having met Thomas Keller, a brilliant, kind artist, during a summer abroad in Florence. Her eyes softened as she described him, his robust build, the kind eyes, the salt and pepper beard that framed a perpetually gentle smile. He was everything. Richard wasn't. Gentle, understanding, passionate, truly seeing her, not just the socialite she was expected to be. He listened to her, encouraged her dreams, and spoke of art with a reverence that resonated deep within her soul. Their affair had been brief, intense, and utterly consuming, a desperate escape from the suffocating expectations of her privileged, yet emotionally barren, life back home. She described a whirlwind of cobbled streets, late-night conversations under ancient Tuscan, stars, and a love that, for a fleeting time, felt utterly boundless. When she returned home, bound by family expectations and a prearranged engagement to Richard, she discovered she was pregnant. The joy of new life was instantly eclipsed by terror. Richard was furious when I told him about the pregnancy, she confessed, her voice cracking, her eyes glistening with unshed tears that finally spilled over, tracing paths through the faint lines on her cheeks. He suspected, he always did. The timing, the dates, they didn't quite align with our engagement. He saw it in my face, in my fear. But he was a man obsessed with appearances, with the Matthews name, with his image in Boston society. A scandal would have destroyed him, ruined his political ambitions, his standing in the financial world. He agreed to marry me, to claim you as his own, on one condition, that I never speak of Thomas, never acknowledge the truth, never even hint at it. He said it would disgrace the family, ruin his career, destroy everything he had built. He promised to treat you as his own daughter, Alara. He truly did. He swore he would. But the bitterness, it festered inside him. It consumed him. And you, my sweet girl, you were a constant, living reminder of his humiliation, of a truth he couldn't control, a wound to his pride that never healed. You were a daily testament to his inadequacy, to my indiscretion. The revelation was like pieces of a complex puzzle, finally, perfectly, falling into place. The lifelong coldness, the deep-seated resentment Richard harbored, it wasn't just my perceived shortcomings. It was a constant, living reminder of his wife's transgression, of a child not of his blood, who he felt had been foisted upon him, a stain on his immaculate family tree. My heart ached for Sylvia, for the impossible burden she had carried, the impossible choice she had been forced to make to protect her child, to maintain a semblance of stability in a world that would have condemned her. But there was also a profound relief, a sense of vindication that resonated deep within my bones. It wasn't me. It was never me. It was him. His own unresolved shame, his own deep-seated insecurities, his colossal, fragile ego. Did Thomas ever know? I asked, my voice barely audible, choked with emotion. Sylvia shook her head slowly, a fresh tear tracing a path down her cheek. I couldn't tell him. Richard threatened to ruin him, to destroy his burgeoning art career, to make sure he'd never exhibit again, never sell another piece. Thomas was just starting out, so full of promise, so pure in his art. I couldn't risk it. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, Alara, letting him go, keeping you from him. But I knew Richard was capable of anything when his pride was at stake. She reached across the table, taking my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, as if pouring years of suppressed love, of unspoken truth into my palm. But I never stopped loving him, and I never stopped loving you, my daughter. I just couldn't show it, not openly, not without risking Richard's wrath, risking losing you altogether. Every kind word, every hidden gesture, every silent embrace was me trying to give you the love I couldn't openly express. The tears finally came, for both of us, a shared deluge of decades of unspoken pain, not tears of sorrow, not entirely, but of release, of shared truth, of a connection finally unfettered by secrets and fear. We talked for hours, unraveling years of unspoken pain, years of silence and guarded emotions. Sylvia shared stories of Thomas, his kindness, his artistic spirit, the way he saw the world through an empathetic, vibrant lens. I learned about a man who sounded like everything I wished Richard had been, a man whose artistic passion mirrored my own long-suppressed creative inclinations. It was a strange, bittersweet gift, this new knowledge, a foundation for a new identity built on authenticity, on truth. He wasn't just a name. He was a person, a history, a part of me I was only just beginning to uncover. My bond with Sophia also deepened exponentially in the weeks that followed. She arrived at Aunt Carol's a few days after my initial conversation with Sylvia, having gently extracted the full truth from our mother after a series of tearful phone calls. Sophia had always been my closest confidant, my silent ally in the emotional battlefield of Ashworth Manor. But now, there was an even deeper understanding, a shared resentment for the emotional manipulation and veiled abuse we'd both endured under Richard's roof. She confessed how she'd always felt a similar, though less intense, pressure from Richard, how his constant belittling of me had often made her feel guilty, helpless, wishing she could intervene but fearing his wrath herself. She revealed her own struggles with his casual dismissiveness of her artistic pursuits, deeming them frivolous and a waste of a good mind, a stark contrast to his praise for James's business acumen. We spent hours dissecting our childhoods, piecing together moments that now made perfect sense through the lens of Richard's secret, his subtle acts of cruelty, his blatant favoritism, the almost imperceptible way he'd undermine us, particularly me, with a cutting remark or a dismissive glance. We laughed, we cried, and we planned for a future where our family was defined by love and honesty, not by blood or obligation, not by the suffocating dictates of a patriarch who was never truly a father. We spoke of setting boundaries, of reclaiming our narratives, of building a network of support that excluded the toxicity we'd grown up with, a future where our bond was based on genuine affection and mutual respect. In the months that followed, my journey became one of profound self-discovery and moral reclamation. The initial quietude gave way to a vibrant exploration. I reevaluated everything: my career, my relationships, my priorities. The frantic, cutthroat pace of Wall Street, once a necessary arena for proving my worth, now felt empty. The adrenaline rushes, the high-stakes negotiations, the seven-figure bonuses, they all seemed like hollow pursuits, a desperate, never-ending quest for external validation that had, ironically, always been unattainable from the one person I sought it from. The intricate dance of power and profit, once exhilarating, now felt like a gilded cage of a different kind. I found myself craving something more authentic, something that resonated with the newly discovered core of who I was. The tailored suits, the rigid schedules, the constant pressure to perform, it all felt like a costume I no longer wanted to wear. I began to envision a life where my worth wasn't tied to my net worth, where my days weren't dictated by market fluctuations, but by my own inner compass. It was a slow, deliberate shift, not a sudden, impulsive leap. I consulted with mentors, explored different avenues, and quietly began to disentangle myself from the demanding grip of high finance, transitioning to a more strategic, less client-facing role that offered more flexibility and a better work-life balance, giving me the space to breathe and think, to truly exist outside the confines of a corporate identity. I found myself seeking out more authentic connections, spending less time in power suits and more time exploring my own interests, passions I'd long suppressed under the weight of Richard's expectations. Started volunteering at a local arts center in New York, a vibrant, bustling hub of creativity, tucked away in a revitalized industrial building in Bushwick. I was drawn to the creative energy, the raw expression, the sheer joy emanating from the artists who poured their souls onto canvas, into clay, into performance. It was a subtle echo of the man I now knew was my biological father, Thomas Keller, whose artistic spirit Sylvia had so lovingly described. I began taking painting classes myself, hesitantly at first, then with a growing sense of joy and freedom. The act of mixing colors, the brushstrokes on canvas, the messy, uninhibited process of creation, it was profoundly therapeutic. It was a language I hadn't known I spoke, a part of myself I had deliberately neglected, convinced it was frivolous, just as Richard had dismissed Sophia's passions. But here, in this vibrant space, surrounded by people who celebrated expression, it felt like coming home. I painted abstract pieces, letting emotions dictate the flow of color and form, a stark contrast to the structured, logical world of finance. It was messy, imperfect, and utterly mine, I started to build relationships not based on what they could give me professionally or how they reflected on my image, but on genuine connection and shared values. I found new friends who celebrated me for who I was, for my growing sense of peace, for the quiet joy I found in art, not for what I achieved in the boardroom. These friendships were built on mutual respect and genuine affection, a refreshing change from the transactional relationships that had defined much of my adult life. I hadn't reached out to Thomas Keller yet. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, a monumental step I was still preparing for. I'd done extensive research, found his gallery, seen his beautiful, evocative work online. There was a part of me, a deep, yearning part, that wanted to meet him, to see if I recognized myself in his eyes, to hear his voice, to connect with a lineage I had never known. But there was also a cautious fear, a desire to protect this newfound peace, to ensure that any future connection was built on strength, not desperation, not a search for another form of validation. The possibility, the knowledge that there is a part of me, a true lineage, waiting to be discovered, was a constant source of quiet hope, a future pathway I was slowly, deliberately considering. The decision to finally reach out to Thomas Keller wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a gradual coalescing of courage, spurred by conversations with Sylvia and Sophia. My mother, in particular, encouraged me, her voice now firm with a conviction she hadn't possessed for decades. "He deserves to know, Alara," she'd said one evening, as we sat on Aunt Carol's porch, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. "And you deserve to know him. He was a good man, a kind man. You have so much of him in you. I see it now, clearer than ever." Sophia simply nodded, her hand resting on my arm, a silent but powerful affirmation of support. The fear of disrupting my newfound equilibrium was real, a tangible weight in my chest. What if he rejected me? What if the reality didn't live up to the idealized version I had built in my mind? But the yearning, the quiet curiosity that had simmered beneath the surface of my life, was growing too strong to ignore. I wrote him a heartfelt letter, pouring out my truth, my journey, my newfound understanding. Along with the letter, I included a small watercolor I had painted, an abstract piece that conveyed a sense of longing and new beginnings, a subtle way to share a part of myself before meeting. The wait was agonizing. Days stretched into weeks, each one a test of my resolve. I checked my phone compulsively, jumped at every notification, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I tried to focus on my painting, on my new, less demanding work schedule, on the vibrant conversations with Sophia, but a part of me was constantly attuned to the possibility of a reply from the man who was, unknowingly, my biological father. Then, nearly 3 weeks later, an email arrived. The sender, Thomas Keller. My hands trembled as I opened it, a mix of fear and excitement swirling within me. His reply was brief, almost impossibly gentle, yet filled with a profound emotional weight that resonated deep within me. He wrote that he had received my letter and the painting, that he was overwhelmed and deeply moved. He confirmed the summer in Florence, the intensity of their connection, and his enduring love for Sylvia, a love he had carried silently, privately, for all these years, a testament to a true and lasting bond. He expressed a quiet sorrow for the life they never had, for the years he didn't know about me, a regret that was palpable even in his concise words. He ended by saying, "I would be honored, Alara, if you would consider meeting me. I often show my work at the Old Mill Gallery in Ridgefield, Connecticut. I'll be there this Saturday, from noon until 5. No pressure, just an open door. Ridgefield. So close, yet a lifetime away. A bridge to a past I never knew existed." That Saturday morning, the air was crisp, imbued with the sharp scent of turning leaves, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue, promising a day of clarity. The Mercedes S-Class, once a symbol of a desperate plea for validation, now carried me with a quiet dignity, a vehicle of my own choosing, taking me towards a future I was actively building, one brushstroke at a time. I drove the familiar route towards Connecticut, but this time, my destination was new, unfamiliar, yet profoundly significant. The Old Mill Gallery was a charming, rustic space, a converted gristmill with exposed wooden beams and large windows overlooking a meandering stream, a serene backdrop for art. Sunlight streamed into the main exhibition hall, illuminating vibrant canvases and intricate sculptures, each piece telling a story. My heart hammered as I stepped inside, a nervous flutter, but also a deep sense of purpose. The gallery was quiet, a few patrons milling about, a soft hum of conversation filling the air. And then I saw him, Thomas Keller. He was standing near a large, abstract piece, his back to me, talking to a young couple. His salt and pepper beard was just as Sylvia had described, his build robust, his posture calm, and radiating a quiet strength. He exuded an aura of gentle wisdom, of profound, creative energy, precisely as my mother had portrayed him. "Mr. Keller," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor ran through my hand, a slight physical manifestation of the monumental moment. He turned, and in that instant, time seemed to blur, to stretch, to reconfigure itself. His eyes, they were kind, exactly as Sylvia had said, but more than that, they were startlingly familiar. They were my eyes, the same keen, sharp blue, though softened by years of experience and, I now realized, a deep well of unspoken emotion. A wave of recognition, of connection, washed over me, a feeling so profound it nearly buckled my knees, a primal acknowledgement of belonging. It wasn't just a physical resemblance, it was an energy, a resonance, a quiet hum of recognition that vibrated deep within my very core, a sense of finally finding a missing piece of myself. A slow smile spread across his face, a gentle warmth that reached his eyes, mirroring the light in mine. "Elara," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone, exactly as I'd imagined it, filled with a quiet joy. "You came." "I did," I replied, my own smile forming, a genuine, unburdened smile that felt entirely new, free of the past's constraints. There was no awkwardness, no forced pleasantries, no need for explanations, just a quiet, profound understanding, a connection forged in truth. We talked for hours, sitting on a worn wooden bench in a sunlit corner of the gallery, the world outside fading away. He spoke of his art, his life, his travels, his philosophy. I spoke of mine, carefully omitting the more painful details of Richard, focusing instead on my journey of self-discovery, my newfound passions, my artistic stirrings that now felt so deeply connected to him. He listened with an intensity that was both comforting and deeply validating, his gaze steady and empathetic. He saw me, truly saw me, not as an extension of someone else's ambition, not as a disappointment, but as a person, a unique individual with her own story, her own dreams, her own inherent worth. He spoke of Sylvia with such tenderness, a quiet reverence that brought tears to my eyes, tears of gratitude for a love that had, against all odds, managed to transcend decades and distance, a testament to enduring human connection. "Your mother is a remarkable woman," he said, his gaze distant for a moment, lost in memory, a profound respect in his voice. "And your painting, Elara." He picked up the small watercolor I'd sent, which he had placed carefully on a nearby table, as if it were a precious artifact. "It's extraordinary. You have a true eye for color, for emotion. It reminds me of myself when I was starting out. The raw honesty." His praise wasn't performative or conditional. It was genuine, a simple acknowledgement of talent, a validation of a part of myself I was just beginning to embrace, a part that had lain dormant for so long. It was the kind of praise I had craved my entire life from Richard, but it meant infinitely more coming from this man, a man who saw me, truly saw me, without expectation or judgment, only love and recognition. The connection with Thomas continued to blossom, enriching my life in ways I hadn't imagined. We met regularly, sometimes at his gallery, sometimes for quiet lunches in New York, exploring the city's hidden artistic gems, discovering new painters and sculptors. He became a mentor, a gentle guide in my artistic exploration, encouraging me to experiment, to trust my instincts, to paint from the heart, to let my emotions flow onto the canvas. He never pushed, never demanded, simply offered his wisdom and his unwavering support, fostering my burgeoning talent. He introduced me to other artists, to a world where creativity was celebrated, where vulnerability was a strength, not a weakness, where expression was paramount. It was a world entirely antithetical to the rigid, cutthroat finance world I had inhabited for so long. and it felt like breathing fresh air after years in a sealed vault, a liberation of the spirit. My professional life continued its quiet transformation. The strategic role I had moved into at Goldman Sachs offered me the flexibility I craved, allowing me to dedicate more time to my art, to my family, to myself. The frantic chase for the next big deal, the relentless pursuit of financial dominance, had faded into the background, no longer holding its consuming power. I was still good at what I did, my intellect and drive undiminished, but it no longer consumed me. My worth was no longer tied to my quarterly earnings or my market predictions. It was tied to the quiet joy of a brushstroke, the laughter shared with Sophia over coffee, the profound peace found in my mother's embrace, and the unexpected warmth of discovering a father who saw my soul, a connection that felt truly authentic. I still drive the Mercedes S-Class. It's no longer a symbol of a failed peace offering, a desperate, misguided gesture. It is simply a beautiful, powerful car that takes me where I choose to go, on my own terms. Sometimes I drive it to Bushwick for my art classes. The polished black exterior, a stark contrast to the gritty, vibrant streets of the industrial neighborhood, a symbol of my duality. Other times, I drive it to Greenwich to visit Sylvia and Sophia, the car a silent testament to the journey I've undertaken, a physical manifestation of the independence I've claimed, the life I've built. My life is no longer a quest for approval, but a vibrant exploration of who Alara Hawthorne truly is, unburdened by the shadow of a man who denied my worth for so long. The true family I found wasn't in the confines of Ashworth Manor, but in the brave truth of my mother and the unwavering support of my sister, and most importantly, in the quiet, undeniable strength I found within myself, a strength that allowed me to seek out and embrace a new, authentic connection with Thomas Keller. This isn't a story of revenge, not in the bitter, destructive sense. It's a story of moral reclamation, of reclaiming my narrative, my identity, and my own boundless worth. It's the story of Alara, finally, truly, unequivocally, free.